Josh Patterson. He is an associate professor in the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatics Sciences, which is in the University of Florida, IFAS, and he's also an affiliate extension specialist with Florida Sea Grant. And Josh has been here at UF for over 8 years, and he came here after he completed his PhD in renewable natural resources from LSU in 2014. And Josh's research program is really interesting and diverse. His work focuses on restoration aquaculture, which is the practice of actively enhancing populations and ecosystem using cultured aquatic organisms. So you'll hear some more probably about that definition and that work during this talk. But he doesn't just work on seagrass, which he's here to talk to us about today. He's worked on a wide array of organisms, including finfish, oysters, bay scallops, corals, sea urchins, and sponges. And he is based full-time at the Florida Aquarium Center for Conservation in Tampa Bay. So I'll stop my screen share and go ahead and hand it over to you, Josh.
Ooh. Thank you, Savannah. I appreciate that introduction. Let me get my stuff set up. Okay, is everybody seeing the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great, cool. Thank you very much. Okay, yeah, I want to start off. Thank you so much, Savannah and Laura, for the invitation to come be a part of this Nature Coast Currents webinar series. I appreciate the invitation as an aquaculture person and a restoration person, because I need to preface this by saying I am not a seagrass person. And so it's also a bit intimidating to be presenting on seagrasses to a couple of seagrass experts. So at the end, if anybody has any really hardcore seagrass questions, I will direct those to Savannah and Laura. But what I am going to talk about today is something that, if for anybody that was around for the last month's webinar, got a good introduction to the issue of propeller scarring on the Nature Coast. And so what we're interested in is looking at ways to prevent and potentially restore scars that have already occurred. And so I don't need to go too much into my affiliations because Savannah covered those. For this particular project, I need to start by acknowledging the project team. So Savannah was a big part of this project. Brittany Hall-Scharf is the Hernando County Sea Grant agent. And from conceptualization of the project on through, she was really important to getting this work done. Shelby Thomas and Connor McDonald are a couple of PhD students. Shelby, I actually advise in the Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences program, and Connor was in the Soil, Water, and Ecosystem Sciences program, and they did a lot of the field work and a lot of the data collection. We're not going to get too down into the weeds on any data today, but they were also instrumental to this work. The Big Bend Seagrasses Aquatic Preserve, Tim Jones and his team there were, in terms of local knowledge of the area and that sort of thing, and also field support, boat time and staff time were big parts of this. And then finally, Mark and Art with Citrus County, also especially in terms of the navigational aid that we'll talk about. That deployment would not have really been possible without the boat support and staff support that was provided by Citrus County Aquatic Services. So thanks so much to all those folks, and of course more that I don't have time to mention. And then for funding, the US EPA through their Gulf of Mexico program was a primary funding source for this particular work that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to try something new. I want to start off with a subjectivity statement. And so this is something that I've just learned about recently. It comes from social sciences and qualitative research. And what it is a summary of who the researcher is in relation to what or whom they are studying. And so in biology and more quantitative research, we really value objectivity, right? Once we're out there studying what it is that we plan to study, we want to be as objective as possible. So we use random assignment and controls and all these sorts of things in an attempt to not bias the research. However, one of the things that I really enjoy about the role that I have is that I get to pick and choose more or less what I want to work on, right? There's nobody telling me you have to work on propeller scars and seagrasses. So that's where the subjectivity, even in what we do, comes into me. We're not really neutral parties in all of this. And so I wanted to give you some context for me personally and my motivations for working on these sorts of projects. And so this is a picture of my daughter. Savannah mentioned we're in the Tampa Bay area. She's living her best life on a boat there, heading out to the sandbar. And so, one of the locations we're going to talk about today is a really popular sandbar with boaters. And so it's the type of place I could really, see myself and my family hanging out. I do want to point out she's drinking a Sprite there. That's not something we would normally provide for her, but my mother-in-law was on the boat that day and she was slinging these sugary beverages. And so you can't tell grandma no. So anyway, and then this is a keeper gag that I was able to catch in the shipping channel in Tampa Bay just a couple of weeks ago. And this is a fish species that, there's a good chance this fish started its life as a juvenile in some seagrass beds. And so, I am a user of the resources as well. And then this is my son, and we're out. This is up in Pasco County, but we're out scalloping, and we'll talk about scallops in a little bit. But again, another use of the resource. And so these are some of the connections that I have to seagrasses. And so one of the reasons I'm interested in working on propeller scarring. Really brief introduction. You probably got some of this last month, but seagrasses in Florida specifically, there's a couple of regions, one being the Big Bend, which we're focused on in this webinar series, and then South Florida, Florida Bay, and the Keys area. You see the big blob of green down there in the south part of the state. Seagrasses are really important all over the state. It's a huge topic and issue in Tampa Bay, as well as, of course, in the Indian River Lagoon and other areas. But the extent of, the acreage extent of seagrasses is really the greatest in the Big Bend area, where you've got really low levels of shoreline development, urbanization, and a shallow sloping coastline that allows light to hit the bottom a good distance away from shore. So you get seagrasses that grow all the way out to pretty far distances from shore. And one of the really culturally and economically significant things that these seagrasses support in the Big Bend region in the Nature Coast is scalloping. And so this is an activity that draws a lot of people. I know from the Tampa Bay region, there's a lot of people that head north during scallop season for long weekends to go scalloping. It's extremely popular. The whole family can do it. It's kind of like an underwater Easter egg hunt. As this picture shows, even little small kids could get in on the action. And so you got a lot of boats in shallow water over really nice seagrass beds. And I mentioned the economic activity surrounding that. I mean, there's people are staying in hotels, they're purchasing dinner, they're buying gas. And so it's a big, important part of the economy in this relatively rural area of the state. Unfortunately, there are also impacts that can come along with the influx of that many people, right? And so it's not exclusively people from out of town during scallop season that are causing propeller scars, but it certainly, is a contributing factor. I'm sure that plenty of scars are caused by locals as well. But essentially, so I believe this photo is actually from Florida Bay. But propeller scars occur generally in very shallow water, where the lower unit of the boat motor can hit the bottom. And generally, I think, they occur inadvertently, right? Nobody is really trying to run their motor through seagrass areas. It's a good way to like lose a lower unit. I don't think it's the teenager in a church parking lot scenario where people are just doing donuts and intentionally causing this problem. And so we're going to get into this a bit later, but it's the type of thing where simple behavior changes we think could really have an impact in reducing the levels of propeller scarring that we see. But what occurs with these scars is, and they can vary, right? So a scar that just removes a couple centimeters of sediment and rhizomes may naturally heal over time and may, that may not be as big of an issue. However, these scars can also be, depending on the size of the boat and the motor, they can be 18 inches deep or more. And so when we see those scars, or we see the big, what we call a blowhole, where the boat actually fully runs aground and damages the bottom in that way, those scars often don't heal on their own. So the grasses will not grow down into that scar. And so the issue of propeller scarring and the idea of restoring propeller scars is not really novel. It's something, certainly not something that was our idea to work on. There's been 20 more years of really good research, long-term data sets by groups at NOAA and FWC and various universities around the state. And this figure, this Kenworthy et al. Figure is from a paper that's just one example of that body of research that exists. I will say that in my review of the literature, a lot of this work has been done in South Florida and the Keys. And so there are some similarities and some differences between the Nature Coast area and South Florida that we need to be aware of when we're thinking about propeller scar restoration. So the general idea of restoration is just to bring the scar back up to grade. It's really pretty low tech and pretty simple. Natural recovery can often occur if the scar is properly brought back up to grade. If you think about South Florida and the Keys, it's a little more tropical, right? The water's a little warmer, the days are a little longer in winter. And so that's one difference. Another difference is the nutrient composition of the sediments and the pore water within the sediments. In the Keys, seagrasses are often phosphorus limited, whereas that's not necessarily the case up further north, Tampa Bay and the Nature Coast area. One of the similarities is the suite of species that we're working with. So that climax community that you see to the far right is usually Thalassia, it's turtle grass. And then the early successional species, where they're talking about these planting units, which I'll also get into later, is Haliduli, which is a more ephemeral, like I said earlier, successional species. So these authors have the idea here of what they call modified compressed succession, where there is this natural succession that might occur in a seagrass community from the earlier species such as Haliduli to the climax species such as Thalassia. And the idea is that by addition of phosphorus in a phosphorus limited area or planting units of Haliduli, this process could be sped up. Regardless, even with this modified compressed succession, you see the timeline on the bottom there. We're talking about 2 to 10 years before we really start to see signs of recovery. So something to keep in mind as well. Even when it's successful, this is a process that takes a really long time. So that's a little bit of background. And I'm just going to outline for you the next 4 sort of segments of the talk that I'm going to get into, and then we'll move into all the specific aspects of this talk. And so for this particular propeller scar restoration project, the first thing we needed to do was identify heavily impacted areas. So if we don't know where the scars are, it's really difficult to reduce impacts in those areas or restore them. And then the restoration process is fairly expensive. And so before we went in and just restored areas, we wanted to do, use the best available information that we could to try to decrease impacts in those selected areas. So, best available techniques that were, within reason. And then after that, the idea was to go in and do some restoration of these major scars. So I am not aware of a ton of propeller scar restoration work that has been published in the Nature Coast Big Bend area in the past. And so these were some of the first data that we're aware of that we're sort of generating on these particular systems. And then we had a boater engagement, community outreach aspect of this project as well that I'll detail. So the first bullet point was identifying the impacted areas. And what we were able to do is use aerial imagery that's generated by the Southwest Florida Water Management District. I think every couple of years, generally, they have aircraft that go out and take photographs from relatively low altitude of all the seagrasses within their jurisdiction. And so this is done at no small expense to the Water Management District, and they're, it's a nice public resource to have. These photographs are much higher resolution than, for example, like satellite imagery on Google Earth and that sort of thing. And so we use those images and contracted with a GIS expert that did prop scar identification from those images. And this is a screen grab from one of those outputs. We did find higher levels of prop scarring up in Citrus County and relatively lower levels down in Hernando County. The more heavily scarred areas are in red there. The orange is moderate, and green is there are scars existing, but it's lighter. So this is one of the things that we used. I mentioned earlier Tim Jones and his group at the Aquatic Preserve. And so in addition to this, more quantitative look at it, talking to them and the folks that are out there on the water and really know the areas that just from experience, know some of these areas that would be worth targeting. So of course we can't just use the aerial imagery and that kind of stuff. This was a chilly day in January of 2018. And so we do also need to go out and ground truth these areas before we make the investment in protecting or restoring. We went out there with a pretty high precision GPS and ground truth specific scars, as well as areas that we were interested in. And we identified a couple of areas that I'll actually get into in a little more detail later. So the next step in that timeline of the project is looking at ways to try to decrease the impacts of propeller scarring in these areas. And so this work really built on some previous research that Savannah and colleagues had done, looking at a couple of different interventions. One was a community-based marketing type campaign, and the other was basically non-regulatory aids to navigation. So caution buoys is sort of the normal way to say that. And Savannah et al. Found that the caution buoys actually had a pretty decent effect in terms of getting folks to slow down before they reach this one specific sandbar called Sandy Hook in Citrus County. And so the idea was to expand on that. So I believe in Savannah's study, they had six buoys. And so we installed a total of, I think it was 25 more buoys in that area. And then in another area, Fish Creek to the south of that we had identified. And so that's barges, so a Citrus County barge. And this is just an example. I actually have a video that hopefully will work for everybody. And you can see this was the day that we did the Fish Creek installation. So we put 21 buoys out there. There's the process that's Savannah in the water. And so we needed to identify, we had GPS coordinates for the, that we had for the permits to put these buoys out, but we still needed to identify a specific area. And so there's the barge backing off, and you can see the buoy. It was pretty sporty out there that day. It wasn't the best day to be doing this work, but we did get all 21 buoys out in a single day, I believe. On a much nicer day, here's an example of where we were aiming to place those buoys. So it's a concrete anchor with some pretty robust hardware connecting to the buoy. And we, of course, don't want to destroy existing seagrass resources. So we placed all the buoys in bare areas. And the idea was really to go outside of the really contiguous seagrass areas. So this is one of Mark Clark's drone maps that he created of the Sandy Hook area. And I think you might be able to see my pointer, but you can see this is the area that is really heavily impacted that we're interested in protecting. It's really nice contiguous seagrass, and you can see the scars in there. And the blue arrows are each buoys. And if you may actually be able to see the little white speck of the buoy, but buoy 5 and 6 had been part of Savannah's previous work. And then we expanded that array out to the west and a little bit more to the east there at Sandy Hook. And then this is a figure that Shelby created that's zoomed out even a little further, so you can see the buoy array protecting that sandbar there at Sandy Hook. There's also a channel that comes out to the east of that area. And so a lot of those scars we think are actually potentially created by people that are cutting out of that channel too early. And we see this a lot with propeller scars, where people are in the channels that they're intended to be in, but then instead of running all the way out to the end of the channel, they'll cut across earlier than they should. And inadvertently create propeller scars. And then the other area was in Fish Creek this is still in Citrus County, but to the south. And what this was really an informal channel. There's a sort of a primitive boat launch just to the west that you can't see in the image here. That's probably primarily used by local folks. And there were some PVC poles and things marking this channel. But what we were essentially trying to do with the navigational aids here was create more distinct channel markers for this Fish Creek area. And so what Savannah and her group had done previously was some boater observations of the area before and after the buoys were installed. And so Shelby, for some of her PhD work, expanded on this, adding Fish Creek, and then once the additional buoys were added in Sandy Hook. And what we found overall was that the buoys were actually pretty effective in the Sandy Hook area in terms of getting people to slow down before they reach the sandbar. We did still, and I'll get into this a little later, they weren't foolproof, right? We saw new propeller scars come in after the buoys were installed, but it did have a positive effect on boater behavior. In Fish Creek, this unfortunately was not the case to the same extent. So people, it's the two areas are very different. right? So when you're implementing this kind of thing, I think you have to think about how these areas are being used. People are transiting through the Fish Creek area, and it may be more local folks than at Sandy Hook. So we didn't see the same effect of boats slowing down at Fish Creek. And the other thing I'll note with the buoys is that to a certain extent, ongoing maintenance has become an issue. So some of the hardware is breaking down, the buoys are breaking down. So that's just something when you install this kind of thing that you have to think about down the road is the maintenance. So that's the protection aspect. And then the restoration aspect comes in. And so we identified major scars through GIS and ground truthing that we were interested in restoring. And that process kind of looks like this. It's a sediment tube is what's used. The photos on the right are a hopper that is filled with sand and sediment. And then the bags are placed 2 at a time under the red outlets there. And they're placed onto pallets. This is myself and Shelby and Jim Anderson, who founded this particular company. And so they're loaded onto pallets. These are fabricated down in Ruskin, Florida, about 15 minutes south of where I work. And they're then transported up to Citrus County for this project and stacked and staged on pallets there near the boat ramp. Really importantly, a shallow draft barge is used for this. We don't want to create more propeller scars while the tubes are being installed. And so the tides are very important to keep an eye on, and using a shallow draft vessel. And I have another video that I hope will work here. Yeah. And this shows the installation process. It's pretty low tech. That being the snorkeler there that is hand placing those they're cotton tubes, so the biodegradable cotton filled with sediment. For this project, we installed over 7,000 sediment tubes, and so it was a relatively decent scale project. As they zoom out, you'll see the lighter white there on the left. And you'll see a couple of blowholes where a vessel has fully run aground and caused a big disturbance. But you can see the Sandy Hook area here, some oyster bars out in the distance, and it's just a really nice, and there's actually one of our buoys there as well. So it's kind of the top side view of what they look like. And then this is to give you an idea. Hopefully this video is working again for everybody, but this is me snorkeling one of the buoy or one of the restored propeller scars at Fish Creek. So I'm on the top of the water here, and this gives you an idea of the shallowness of the water that we're working with. You would not normally have those PVC posts and stuff and the bobbers. This was actually, so Connor McDonald, who I mentioned, was doing PhD work looking at potentially fertilizers and other amendments that could be added to the sediment. So this was an experimental prop scar where we were subdividing by treatment and coming back and looking. But yeah, so this gives you an idea. This is these 2 bags wide was this scar. Some of these are 3 bags wide or even bigger. And the other thing that can occur is if you have like a boat that has double outboards or even 3 outboards and creates 2 parallel scars, that little strip of grass that's left in between the scars is really quite unstable and subject to further degradation. So coming to the end of this scar here. So that's the overall basic sediment tube concept. Again, just get the damage back up to grade and hope that it will naturally recolonize. In the earlier figure, I had some haliduli planting units that were part of the Kenworthy paper, and we tested those as well in this system. And so this is kind of what they look like up close: little sprigs of haliduli in little biodegradable planting units. Another strategy that's been used that we tested here was our Bivory exclusion cages to protect those newly planted haliduli units until their rhizomes can get a little bit more established. And so that's Shelby. This was one of the treatments that was used in the experiment I'll describe in a minute. The visibility was not fantastic the day that these cages were installed, but we installed a total of 25 cages. We had scars that received cage plantings and uncaged plantings. And this is kind of what it looked like there around Sandy Hook. Pretty imperfect, pretty messy, but the scars are where they are. And so we did the best we can to get representative areas. So anything that's green, blue, or red here received sediment tubes. So the sediment tube was the baseline. The green scars were also planted with the haliduli planting units on 1-foot centers. And the red scars were planted and caged. So there are 5 cages that went across each of those cage scars. So what we would do in terms of monitoring is we did this for 2 years because, again, from some of the previous work, we expected this to take a while. So starting in April of 2019, and then quarterly from there, we monitored each of these scars for 2 years. And this was done by 5 randomly selected locations on each scar. So we knew how long each scar was. We would get a random number generator, and before we went out in the field, generate the locations based on length down the scar at which we would monitor. We used a 25 by 25 centimeter quadrat, which is a little smaller than you would normally use for seagrass work, but we wanted it to fit within the width of the scar. And then the other thing we did, so we had 2 unrestored control scars that were also monitored, and we monitored an adjacent reference area. So we had 5 sampling stations on each scar, and what we would do was on 2 of those, we would flip that or the quadrat over 2 times and collect percent cover and shoot count data in adjacent healthy seagrass as well. And so these data need to be massaged a little bit more and more formally analyzed. But on the y-axis, you have percent seagrass cover. And so this is kind of overall. The reference areas range anywhere from 60 to 100%. And again, in a more temperate area like this, you're going to get some dieback in the winter of the grasses. So you see some of that seasonality where the springtime, right after you're coming out of winter, sort of some of your lower coverage, and then it kind of increases throughout the warmer months. You'll also note the gray line on the bottom, the unrestored scars showed really no evidence of recovery. And then one of the interesting things that we found was that basically regardless of the treatments that were applied on top of the sediment tubes, by 2 years, any scar that received tubes had reached about half of the unscarred reference percent coverage of seagrass. So that was really encouraging that within that 2-year window, we're starting to see some good recovery there of those scars. This breaks it down by shoot counts with haliduli, that early successional species on the top, and thalassia on the bottom. You do initially see, and remember, so the 2 darker green bars did receive at the very beginning 1-foot centers of thalassia plugs. And so there might be numerically a little bit higher thalassia there at the very beginning. But eventually what you see is that ephemeral nature sort of take over, seasonal diebacks that haliduli is more subject to. And that sort of just turns into a bunch of noise with the exception of the unrestored control. With the thalassia, you do see a more consistent positive trajectory. And once again, it's similar across the restoration treatments. So we really didn't see any benefit of planting or caging. And so that's important to know because the planting and the caging are an extra added expense, right? So if we were going to continue or expand this type of work in the area, we would probably, you get the most bang for your buck with just straight sediment tubes. And one of the things that was anecdotally, Shelby told me she noticed quite a bit was those planting units actually sort of dislodging. So this is a pretty high energy area. There's a pretty big tidal range, and the tides at times is really ripping through there. And so we think that, the planting units might be potentially a better option in a lower energy area. So that was the active restoration. And then I'll just talk a little bit about the boater engagement that was part of this project as well. So we did this across the summers of 2019 and 2021. We were going to do 2020 as well, but that was lost due to COVID. And what we did was we targeted 2 boat ramps in Hernando County and 2 boat ramps in Citrus County on weekends during scallop season. And so in 2019 and 2021, separate sets of interns were hired and trained to, basically, especially during the morning hours when folks were lining up launching at these boat ramps, to talk to boaters about, the 3 different strategies for reducing propeller scarring. And again, this is an issue that is behavioral based, and it's not a huge change you're asking anybody to make. So the more we can engage with community and educate people about staying in marked channels, slowing down and trimming your motor up when you do get into shallow areas, if you're going after some speckled trout or, trying to get to a sandbar, slowing down and trimming up. And then if you do run aground, right, because we all, if a boater tells you they haven't run aground, especially, in Florida, they're probably not telling the truth. So if you do run aground, the thing to do is to jump out and push it off, right? So a lot of times when you see these blowholes, you'll see an entry scar. And then if that boater sits there and churns it up to try to get out, you'll also see an exit scar. And the blowhole is actually also expanded by trying to power off of it. So getting out and pushing off and then trimming up and moving on from there is a really effective way to reduce any further damage once you run aground. So yeah, so we reached over 1,800 boaters with this outreach campaign. There's also a Be Seagrass Safe pledge that's part of a Florida Sea Grant ongoing seagrass campaign that we were able to ask people to sign, obtained over 700 signatures on that. 480 of those people actually provided their email addresses. So Savannah was able to do a follow-up survey with the people that provided email addresses. And, you know, to a certain extent, you're probably self-selecting for people that will, one, provide their email address on a pledge, and two, respond to a survey. But we did see really high percentages of those respondents saying that, you know, they've used the strategies that we talked about with propeller scarring. They're actually discussing those strategies with others, which is 65% of people said they were doing that. So that's really encouraging to just maybe plant those seeds with trusted members of the community and have them disseminate the information. And then actually 50% of people responded affirmatively that they actually did view themselves as stewards of seagrass resources following these interactions at the boat ramp. So that was really encouraging. Again, not a random sample, but some encouraging feedback. There was also a social media aspect, which I won't go too far into, but here's an example of the Snapchat geofilter that was employed at these boat ramps. And so we had the interns sort of encouraging people to look for it. We also printed an Instagram frame and tried to get the message out that way. That's, you know, maybe not so much engagement as it is just outreach and trying to get the message out there. But it was just another interesting aspect that I could talk more about. And then it's hard to see here, but we were giving out stickers and swag and stuff, of course. And so this is a fishing guide, and they got one of our stickers and stuck it on their Seagrass Safe sticker on their boat. And so that was really cool. And this is the kind of thing where, you know, I think people that are going to charter a boat and go out fishing are going to listen to the person taking them out a lot more than they're going to listen to us standing under a tent at the boat ramp talking to them. So these sorts of inroads with people that are making their living out on the water, and if we can get them talking to their clients about the importance of seagrass and of not creating propeller scars, I think this is a really potentially fruitful area moving forward. And then we also did some signage. So this Scars Hurt sign is another thing that had been developed as part of this Sea Grant Seagrass Safe campaign. And again, tough to measure the effectiveness of something like this, but hopefully something that people will see and respond positively to. So just moving into some take-home messages, terms of impact reduction in a non-regulatory sense, it's possible, but it's difficult. So I mentioned the challenges with the buoys. They weren't as effective in some areas as they were in others. You know, the permitting, and it's the type of thing that's just difficult to scale. You know, we've got a lot of shallow seagrass in this state, and we can't just put buoys around all of it, nor would we want to. But in targeted areas, it can definitely have a positive effect. One of the things that we took away from the restoration is in this specific area, as I said, if we're able to expand this type of work in the future, we will just use straight sediment tubes and be able to hopefully purchase more of them than adding planting units and that sort of thing. And then community engagement, I mentioned that this is really just an issue that behavior changes can address. And so it's hugely important, but I do think that it requires some refinement and you know, input from folks in the social sciences and stuff like that to really get at how do we make this behavior change happen, and how do we just educate people about the importance of these resources. And then there's additional strategies that can be explored for scar prevention, right? And so engaging the community in the development of these strategies is also really important. You have to have buy-in from people if you're going to do things like implement slow speed zones, pull and troll zones. You know, when you start talking about restricting access, that's where the community understanding the reasoning behind it is really incredibly important. But some of those strategies have been shown to be quite effective, and they're certainly worth exploring in specific areas. So that's the end of my talk. I want to thank you all very much for your attention. I realize I'm competing head to head with the semifinals of the World Cup for anybody that's following that. So thanks for your attention, and I'll take any questions at this time. And there's my email address if anybody wants to reach out after this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Josh. I mean, that was really great. Like our progression of talks has been from like the swift mud overall mapping of seagrass to mapping propeller scars now to restoring propeller scars. So it's really great. But you have a couple of questions already in the chat. I don't know if you want me to read them out to you or if you want to, but we should repeat them for the recording. Just
yeah, I can do that if that's
cool.
if that works.
Great.
Did you use harvested seagrass from natural beds of haliduli and thalassia for the planting units? My understanding is that there are no thalassia planting units, at least used in this study. All of the thalassia that came in was just sort of naturally, probably expansion of rhizomes from the sides of the scar. The haliduli, my understanding is that's primarily rack that is collected, floating rack that's collected in the water and on the shoreline, and then used in those planting units. And that's really one of the ways that aquaculture comes in, is those things are actually grown in a land-based system on the farm there in Ruskin. And so it's allowed to take root and develop roots within those units. So no, the answer is no, it is not. At least in this case, it was not like harvested from natural seagrass beds. How long does it take for the cotton tubes to biodegrade? So that's actually interesting. One of the things we thought we were seeing early on was, when that sediment goes into the tube, at least in this case, it was pretty sterile. It's not, there's a microbial community and there's all sorts of things in the natural environment that help seagrass growth. And so there is a period there where those sediments need to sort of condition or season, I think. And early on, we thought we were seeing some success with the planted tubes. And honestly, what I think might have been happening was just the act of like poking a hole in the tube to put the planting unit in there might have sort of helped that process along, because it's just cotton, so the water soaks through it. But I think if, sort of maybe poking holes in that cotton actually helps speed it up. In terms of I think it's dependent on water temperature and the time of year they're installed and that sort of stuff. But to directly answer the question, I would say by the third quarter of monitoring, right? So 9 months, there was no evidence of the cotton tubes left. By 6 months, they had certainly started to degrade. But yeah, it was pretty much just sediment by 9 months. And then, is there a reason you chose buoys instead of pilings with markers? I've been working on slow speed zones along the coast and wondering about the difference, especially since you are experiencing breakdown of buoys. Imagine cost is a major factor. Cost and potentially also permitting. I might kick that one to Savannah in terms of, I don't know if it's easier to permit a buoy than a post.
So I haven't ever actually tried to permit pilings, so I don't know that, but I do know that pilings are more expensive to install. And we did also have some concerns in these areas about the amount of substrate. Like, you hit lime rock pretty quickly in a lot of these systems. And so we weren't actually entirely confident that we would be able to install piles, at least with the equipment that we had at our disposal. And another reason was also because it was a grant funded kind of pilot project. And so, we weren't sure how permanent necessarily these buoys or navigational markers were going to be if we found they had no effect and that kind of thing. So, I think if there were a way to work with piles, it's obviously longer lasting, but there are some logistical challenges with the sediment. So that's kind of the answer I would go with. But it may also be true that they're easier to permit because they are more temporary.
Yeah, that's a really good question, though. So those are all the questions in the chat. I don't know if anybody else has any. I'm happy to try to address.
There may be some more coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and start the little evaluation poll just in case. see a lot of folks on here who I know have either installed buoys or done some propeller scar work themselves. So a lot of familiarity in the audience. All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions come in, but thank you so much, Josh, for joining us. And this is recorded, so we'll be archiving it on our page for posterity. And thanks everyone so much for joining us. And our next program is in January, so I'll send a link out for registration for that if anyone wants to check that one out.
Cool. Thank you all very much. Thanks again for the invitation, Laura and Savannah.